How to Train Your MERS, written by JUBE514 and SalParadiseLost. Read to you by Evie is Evil. This fic is rated mature. The creator chose not to use archive warnings, and the category is Gen. This is for the Batman fandom. This fic is mainly a aquarium AU. I'm just going to summarize this how I would summarize it, and then I'll read the summary. Basically an AU where the Bat family are mermaids, and the Justice League are aquarium trainers, so really good fic. Alright, now on to the official summary. Again, and he silently begged for any sea god to please let him out of the dizzying, pitch-black hell. His body ached from getting beaten into the box's side. The water was stale and disgusting in his gills. There wasn't any light, and he couldn't see anything. He was so full of fear that he was beginning to get numb to it. He didn't know what these humans wanted with him, but he knew it couldn't be good if they started by shoving him into this too small box and tossing him around like a boat on an angry sea. Clark is an aquatic mammals trainer at the Metropolis Aquarium, and Bruce is their very unruly new resident. Clark doesn't realize that Bruce is only the first of many MERS that are going to live in the aquarium. And without further ado, on to Chapter 1. He was slammed against the wall of the small, dark tank as the floor under him suddenly tipped. Water splashed, and the small bit of room that he had churned with the motion. It was terrifying and disorienting, and he anxiously twisted in the small space. His tail couldn't stretch. His long fins were being pressed against him because of the walls. He warbled nervously, his heartbeat pounding in his ear, and he tried to dig his claws into one of the container walls. The material was too hard, though, and he couldn't do anything to ground himself against the unpredictable movement. The tank lurched again, and he silently begged for any sea god to please let him out of the dizzying, pitch-black hell. His body ached from getting beaten into the box's side. The water was stale and disgusting in his gills. There wasn't any light, and he couldn't see anything. He was so full of fear, he was beginning to get numb to it. He didn't know what these humans wanted with him, but he knew it couldn't be good if they started by shoving him into this too small box and tossing him around like a boat on an angry sea. He whined into the darkness, trying to call for his older podmate, but the humans had taken him away. They had taken almost everyone away. They had ripped his pod apart. He was alone. He screamed and the box rocked. He stayed cooped up in the darkness, the sound of 2 heartbeats echoing in his ear. The pitch-black coffee Clark drank an hour ago wasn't enough to keep him from dozing off in the pre-intake meeting. "Clark!" Diana snapped, jolting him in his seat. Somewhere to his right, Hal and Lois snickered. "Am I boring you?" "No, sir, ma'am, he said with a shake of his head and a sheepish smile. She glared him down, picking words apart, because, in truth, she was boring him. She was boring all of them. The meeting was a painstaking reinstatement of the intake rules they already knew at 3:42 a.m. Why did MERS always have to get delivered in the tiny hours of the morning? "Good," Diana said with a raised eyebrow, and turned back towards the PowerPoint that was flickering on the pull-down screen. The image clicked, and it showed a large, darkened tank that was so murky the inhabitants could barely be seen. It was dreadful conditions, and Clark's heart ached when he saw it. This guy was fished out of a rich couple's abandoned mansion. They fled the country after the IRS got on their ass about tax fraud, and the FBI started to link that to drug trafficking. After being gone for about 2 weeks, the feds came in to claim the valuables, and found 2 MERS who had been left to die. Diana growled out the words, showing clear displeasure at the thought of the abandonment. Clark couldn't imagine doing that to a living creature. The feds called them in and got them transported out. One is being shipped upstate to live in a refugee, and the younger one is being transferred to us. She frowned and turned back to them all. Luther wants him to be a face for the Metropolis. Something that can perform in shows and do encounters with donors. So our goal is to get him as docile as we can, as soon as possible. Clark's eyes narrowed, and he hummed, drawing the woman's attention. Are we sure that is the best idea? We don't have any idea of his background or history, right? He could be hostile towards human contact, he said, and his supervisor nodded. She cocked a hip and looked back towards the darkened fish tank on screen. I agree with you, but I worry that Luther isn't going to let up on this point. She paced in front of the screen, and they all watched her. Trust me, Clark. I would love to keep him in a one-way glass isolation tank for a couple of months, to reduce his stress and give him a slow introduction. But I just don't think that's going to happen. The aquarium has been losing money since the death of our last mer, and we just aren't drawing in the crowds that we used to, despite the rising costs. I'm afraid that if we don't put this mer into the spotlight as soon as possible, then I'm afraid we might have to start to decide which mouths to feed. Clark sighed tiredly but nodded. He hated it, but before being an education center, the Metropolis Aquarium was a business in the very expensive trade of caring for a couple hundred species of marine life. He knew the Metropolis Aquarium was hurting ever since Sheila died. She had been their star, a gentle beluga whale mer that absolutely adored children and loved interacting with them on a daily basis. She never refused her training or ever acted aggressively with the people that visited her tank. The only time she had acted up was in a mismanaged attempt to enter her into a breeding program years ago, that Clark had quickly pulled her out of. They decided that having her be better behaved was more important than the possibility of breeding her. No aquarium had ever managed to have a pup born in captivity anyways. Other than that, though, she had been perfect for them, and the reason that the Metropolis Aquarium had gained the title of one of the most popular aquariums in the country. Clark missed her dearly, and knew her death would mean that Luther would immediately start searching for her replacement. A replacement that he had apparently found abandoned in a mariner, which was the most confusing part about this decision. As noble as it was to adopt a rescue mer, Clark heavily doubted that Luther made the decision from the goodness of his heart. As one of the premier aquariums in the country, the Metropolis Aquarium would have had their pick of mers from across the country. So why wouldn't Lex have chosen a mer that was already integrated into aquarium life and used to human handling? Why would he take a risk on a rescue that was freshly abandoned by his human keepers, and probably terrified out of his mind because of it? Before Clark could ask more questions, there was a dull screech, and the familiar beeps of a truck backing up. That's our cue, folks, Diana chirped, and everyone rushed into motion. Hal, go prepare the tank, and start booting up its monitoring systems. Arthur and Clark, come with me. I'm gonna need you guys, 'cause this mer is a big one. They nodded and followed their supervisor into the docking area, where the movers were struggling to unload a sealed crate. The box tipped precariously in their arms, and Clark rushed forward to grab a side of it, before it and the mer inside went crashing to the ground. Damn, this thing is heavy, one of the men gasped, and Clark took some of the weight. And it's been wailing for nearly the entire trip. Almost on cue, a hiss came from inside the tank. It was deep and rumbling, but Clark had worked with mers long enough to hear the underlying distress in it. That wasn't good, though not particularly surprising. Clark and Arthur helped the men ease the crate onto the floor, as Diana got the carry net ready. Ready, Dee? Yeah, boys, I'm ready. Let's see our new resident. Arthur nodded, and began heaving the top of the crate. The top whined as the heavy locks were undid, and the airtight seal broke. The mer went suddenly silent. With a dull screech, the top came off. Clark got his first glance at their new inhabitant. Aquarium mers were generally similar looking. They had dull colors, and typically only ranged from a cream-colored white to charcoal. They were also usually from the porpoise family, because the mammal-based subspecies proved to be the easiest to domesticate. Brightly colored exceptions to that generality could be found, but only across the sea in Africa, Asia, and Oceania, where mer trading was more established and widely done, and even then they were rare. Brightly colored and ray-finned fish were coveted by all aquariums, and he knew that Luther had been itching to get his hands on one. And apparently he had, because this mer was the exact opposite of any other mer that Clark had seen on American soil. He was beautiful, even though his body was squished inside of a tiny space. Instead of the typical slim gray dolphin tail, he bared a huge and flaring set of dorsal and pectoral fins that were attached to a pitch-black, almost iridescent tail. The fins were all lined in a bright, striking yellow that was mesmerizing to watch wave around. The human-looking part of his torso was pale, and he had a handsome face behind the unruly wet hair that fell across his forehead. He was a magnificent creature, and Clark immediately knew why Luther had chosen this mer, instead of the dozens of other mers across the country. "Let's get him into the shit!" The mer whipped his body, flailing around immediately when Arthur began reaching down into the tank. The mer hissed like a demon, baring his impressive set of serrated teeth and snapping towards Arthur's fingers. He pulled back and narrowly missed the tip of his thumb getting bitten off. So much for the hope that this one was already trained to be docile and pliant to human touch. The mer snarled, coiling like a snake and flaring his huge dorsal fin forward. Every inch of his body language said, "Stay away." Clark looked toward Diana. "Luther wants him to be doing encounters with children?" Arthur grumbled as he went to retrieve a grab pole, a long iron stick with a noose at the end, designed to help immobilize animals while keeping the trainer at a distance. He began poking towards the mer, so he could loop it around the mer's neck and keep those jaws away from him. "He's just scared," Diana said, but Clark could see the doubt in her eyes. "He will settle down." Arthur managed to loop it around the mer's neck, and he tightened the line. The noose closed, and the mer's eyes widened in terror as his air was suddenly cut off. He writhed against the line, screeching in desperation and trying to tug it off his own head. "Come on, bud," Arthur murmured, his brows creased in discomfort as he kept the chokehold. "Just calm down and it can all be over." The mer's struggles eventually got weaker, and his screeching turned into frightened whimpers. It felt wrong, and it took everything in Bruce to keep still. After some of the longest moments in Clark's life, the mer finally quieted, and his body slackened in an exhausted heap. Arthur instantly loosened the line and let the mer take in huge gulps of air. The mer was too busy catching his breath to snap at Arthur's hands again. He only managed to flinch as Arthur fit a muzzle onto his face and began moving him into the transport net. It all felt wrong. Very wrong. "Let's get him into his tank," Diana said when the mer had finally been manhandled onto the transport net. "I'm sure he will mellow out once we get him settled in." Bruce did not mellow out. If anything, in the month that he had been there, Bruce got worse. Diana ripped the body armor off her arm and threw it against the wet room wall. It made a damp smack against the concrete and jolted Clark out of his daydreams. He had even realized that the tea he had been nursing had gone cold. The armor piece fell into a pile full of bite-marked, filled, and dented equipment. "He bit me again," she growled as she plopped herself into the seat next to Clark. Her body shuddered with a heavy sigh, and she laced her fingers to rest her head in her hands. "I thought we were getting somewhere, but then he whipped around and tried to bite me." That was an unfortunately common story with anything that had to do with the mer they named Bruce. He was a menace. He tried to bite them when they fed him, when they trained him, when they put their hand a little too close to the lip of his tank. They didn't even dare go into the shallow area of the tank now, after a disastrous incident that almost had Hal dragged into the middle of the tank. It had used to be an area for encounters, a place where the mers could swim right up and interact, so they didn't have to get lifted into the transport net. But it was clear that Bruce wasn't going to allow that to happen. He had drawn blood for more than a few times, and Clark was pretty sure everyone had a scar from him at this point. He was also an escape artist. Initially, they had put him into their main mer tank, which was a densely filled habitat that mimicked a coral reef and kelp forest. But Bruce quickly proved that he could escape from it, and after finding Bruce in about 6 tanks meant for different species, they moved him to their isolation tank. Clark hated the isolation tank. It was completely barren with no enrichment and no privacy. It was just a walled circle with a single window that was depressing to look into. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to live in it. Clark awkwardly shifted in his seat.
Did he manage to catch your skin?
No, he only caught the armor, but... She looked up to meet Clark's eyes. He's supposed to do his first interactions with donors in a week. We can't put kids within lunging distance of a biting murr. She rubbed her forehead, and Clark could imagine the headache that was growing in her skull. Luther is looking into sedatives, and I hate the thought that he will be forced to live the rest of his life on drugs to keep him docile. There was a heavy-sounding thump, and the pounding of what Clark now recognized as a tail slapping against a padlocked top. Bruce must have been growing anxious in the isolation tank. Diana groaned and closed her eyes. Clark looked through the window towards the boarded-up isolation tank. Someone has closed up the curtains on the tank, which meant that Bruce's only way to see out was blocked. The thumping grew more frequent and more panicked sounding. "Please, Bruce, can you give me 10 minutes? Diana mumbled, rubbing her forehead. A muffled bark sound came from the tank, and the high-pitched sound of scratching claws.
"I'll get him,"
Clark said, unable to sit there and ignore the obvious sounds of mere panic.
"Take off for the rest of the day, Diana. You're tired, and I can handle him."
She looked at him through one eye. "You're sure?" He smiled at her. She had so much on her plate right now. He knew she deeply cared about the aquarium and its mission, and as the supervisor of the MER program, it was her duty to make it a success. She was the one that handled the logistics, took the shifts that no one else would take, and bore the brunt of Luther's impossible demands. And more often than not, she managed to do the impossible, and look completely poised while doing it. But the cracks were showing. Bruce didn't know it, but his behavior was definitely driving those cracks deeper. Clark wasn't sure he had ever seen her without the bags under her eyes once Bruce had arrived. "Thanks, Clark."
"Thank you, Dee. Now go home and go to bed."
He walked out the door and towards the rapid-fire thumping.
All right, big boy,"
Clark mumbled as he shoved the cover off the tank. The MER instantly surged towards the surface, not trying to make an escape, just trying to have access to the top. The MER was panting, gills flaring quicker than normal, and movements jerky. After he caught his breath, he slumped and gave a venomous look towards Clark.
I know. You don't like being cooped up. But why don't we try some enrichment?"
Bruce glared, and looked very much like he didn't want to try enrichment, but also didn't fight as Clark brought out some fish to use as treats.
"Come on,"
Clark murmured, trying to get Bruce to comply, so they could make at least a little progress. The MER wasn't food-motivated at all, though, and just gently swam along the edge of his tank, and looked anxiously out into the aquarium beyond. He didn't acknowledge any of the hand signals that Clark tried to motion through, and after 10 minutes of trying to get the MER's attention, Clark gave up. He sat back, watching as the MER paced and peered over the edge of the tank. Occasionally, he warbled into the building and seemed to pause, listening for an answer back. It made Clark's heart clench, and a homesick ache swell from behind his ribs.
"Are you missing someone?"
he asked. The MER's ear fins flickered at his voice, but that was the only acknowledgement he got.
"I'm sorry, but there's no one out there."
Bruce keened a loud, low, sad sound, and kept staring out, silently calling to a MER that wasn't there. Clark wondered who he was missing. "He's not ready," Diana hissed, shoving herself in front of Luther, as he strode towards Bruce's tank. Clark was pacing up at them, and nervously glancing at Diana. This was their last chance. It was so obvious that Bruce wasn't ready, and Clark was terrified about what could happen if a bunch of strangers got shoved towards him. The zookeepers couldn't even manage going 3 days without a bite attempt. Mr. Luther, do you hear me? Diana insisted, her hands and fists at her sides. He's not ready. You have to cancel the encounters.
And will you be refunding the donors, Miss Prince? Especially when their money has already gone into this fish's stomach.
Luther mused, his eyes narrowing, as vicious as a viper.
If the answer is no, then I encourage you to get out of my way. If you continue to refuse, you may place your keys on your desk on your way out.
She glared, but eventually stepped to the side.
Now, I would like to see the troublemaker, and for one of you to fetch me the drug regime that he will be starting. What is that?
The man froze at the edge of the tank, staring into the calm water. Clark blinked and came up to the edge. He could recognize Bruce's body, curled up on the bottom of the tank. He was encircling something black and blue and seemed to be grooming it? He was definitely fixated and didn't spare a moment to look up at the humans standing around him. At first, Clark thought that maybe Bruce had snagged one of his toys or enrichment puzzles. Except then the thing moved. That was impossible, right? It wasn't like a fish from another exhibit grew legs and walked over to the ISO tank. It was impossible for anything else alive to be there.
What is that? Luther asked, rounding on Clark. I thought you were keeping him in strict isolation until his behavior improved. We can't risk any other animals getting hurt because of him.
We do have him in isolation, Diana said from behind Clark. We've had him in isolation for weeks. There shouldn't be anything else in there with him. They were all silent as they watched Bruce peacefully keep grooming whatever had fallen into the water. He lovingly lapped at its side and nuzzled into it.
Draw them both up,
Luther said finally, his voice as cold as ice. I want to see them. Clark looked to Diana and saw his own doubts reflected in her. They both knew how stressful being out of the water was for any mer, and they had no idea how Bruce was going to take whatever he had found being brought up with him. But the boss was staring them down, and they silently went through the motions of raising the mer out of the water. It took approximately 20 seconds for Bruce to start hissing. It was a dangerous rumbling sound that sent a shiver down Clark's spine. It was kind of like a snake, but deeper and much, much larger. It promised pain, and instantly reminded Clark why mers had been considered untouchable predators for a majority of human history. It was the sound of a predator that wouldn't hesitate to rip him to pieces. Bruce snarled as he was taken out of the water, his tail pushing against the net. He stayed coiled up with whatever he found, and didn't leave it, even when Clark and Diana tipped him onto the ground, effectively separating him from his natural element. His large, flowy fins hung like wet blankets around him, and the normally graceful mer looked like a furious wet cat as he huddled in the middle of the floor. His breath was fast. His body was tense. He watched them all warily while keeping the small thing clutched close.
It's an eel?
Clark guessed, taking in the black and blue alternating pattern and the long single-finned tail. It looked like one of the species they had in the main coral reef exhibits, but was much larger than those foot-long eels. It isn't an eel, Diana corrected quietly, something like awe in her voice. It's a pup. The thing in Bruce's arm squirmed, and sure enough, the brightly colored tail gave way to light brown skin and dark, wild hair. He was small, so incredibly small, and Bruce was protecting him like he was the most precious thing in the world.
That's impossible,
Clark gasped.
He's male. There's never been a pup born in captivity. We don't even know how mers reproduce.
It was one of the great mysteries that surrounded mers. No one had seen babies. They had seen children and teens, but the babies were always a mystery. Even this baby, as tiny as it was, wasn't a true newborn. He was too developed, looking more like a 9-month-old child than one that couldn't possibly be more than a couple of hours old. And yet, Bruce stayed crouched around the little miracle, hissing at them and trying to cover the baby with his body. The baby squirmed again and stared out at them with 2 huge blue eyes. His small fingers clutched onto Bruce's fins, and he warbled a tiny, inquisitive sound. Bruce momentarily stopped snarling, to coo and nuzzle at the pup, before turning back to growl again.
It can't be his baby, can it?
Clark questioned.
The species and the skin color? Wasn't he found with one other older male?
He was, Diana confirmed. At least, those were the Murs that were left when the feds came and raided the place. Who knows what happened before that? Luther took a couple of steps closer, his face unreadable, as he surveyed the pair of huddled Murs. Bruce tried scooting away, but eventually his back hit the wall behind him, and he couldn't go any further.
This is an intriguing development,
the businessman said finally, drawing away and turning to walk back.
I want the pup separated immediately.
What? Diana and Clark yelled at the same time, unintentionally startling Bruce and making him yelp. His spines puffed up, trying to make himself look bigger like a startled cat. The pup trilled, his voice light, happy, despite the anxiety of the older Mur.
Mr. Luther, please, this is a delicate situation. We don't know if the relationship of a pup to their parent,
Diana said, practically begging.
We could damage their bond,
Clark supported,
just as desperate as her. We could accidentally harm the pup's development.
True, Luther agreed, but his voice was too musing to hold any weight. He stopped and looked at the Mur over his shoulder.
But we also don't know if any of what you said is true either.
He smiled, and it sent a chill down Clark's spine, just like Bruce's growling did.
I'm not a man that indulges in what-ifs, Mr. Kent. I prefer to focus on reality and the facts of the situation. And the facts as I see them are these. 1. You have a Mur that is misbehaving and refuses to use food as a motivation for good behavior. And 2, you just found the perfect replacement for that motivator.
Luther looked back towards the Murs, the wicked smile still on his face. Bruce snarled in response, baring his fangs towards the human.
Our lucky new father is still scheduled for the donor interactions within 3 days, and he will be docile by then. To motivate his progress towards that goal, he will only be allowed his pup when he is being a tame little fish. When he acts aggressively in any way, take the pup away from him and do not return it until he has calmed down again. I'm sure he will learn the lesson very quickly.
The man began walking away, leaving Clark and Diana with the job of separating parent and child. The Mur's screams as Clark ripped the pup out of Bruce's arms were the worst thing that he had ever heard. The most frustrating thing was that Luther was right. Bruce did learn quickly, and the snarls settled into heart-wrenching whimpers that made Clark feel like the worst person in the world. They still put him on the drugs, too. It was the only thing they could do to stop his mournful keens for his child. It made him clumsy and uncoordinated, but they kept him calmer. When the day of Bruce's first interactions came, he didn't even murmur, but he did flinch away from any hand that came close and stared out into the depths of the aquarium. And that is the end of Chapter 1. There's no author's notes for this, so directly under reader's notes. I love this fic so much. When I first found it, I think I, speed read all of the chapters that are out, which there's 16 out, and it says there's going to be 19, but it's very slow updates. I love this fic so much. It's adorable and sad, but I love it. I really do. Another thing, there's a lot of art that goes with this fic. So you should probably go to the fic and check it out. It's sporadically placed throughout the chapters. The first chapter, there's 3 pieces of art, but I unfortunately can't see them because the URL didn't work. It's linked for Discord, but it says image can't be found. And it has little descriptors, so you can imagine what the art is, but it's just not there. But I'm pretty sure some of the later ones do work, from what I remember. But, I love this fic so much. Yeah. I don't know when I'm posting this, because I'm definitely recording this way ahead of when I will post it, but, yeah. Thank you guys for listening, and bye!